Once upon a time, there was a group of backroom political types in this country who got very good at winning elections for the Progressive Conservative Party. Their best years were in the 1970s and early 80s, creating a juggernaut for the Ontario Tories led by Bill Davis. And they were known as the Big Blue Machine. Former Conservative MP J. Patrick Boyer joins us now with more on this political phenomenon, which he chronicles in his new book, The Big Blue Machine: How Tory Campaign Backrooms Changed Canadian Politics Forever. It's great to have you back here at TVO, Patrick. Nice to see you.
Great to be back, Steve.
Well, I always thought, until I read your book and was straightened out, that the journalist Claire Hoy was the guy who named the Big Blue Machine after those, it was sort of a takeoff on those mid-1970s Cincinnati Reds baseball teams, the Big Red Machine. But you say not the case, that the term actually predates his usage.
George Drew, when he was leading the Progressive Conservatives in Ontario in 1943 election, used that in a speech that he made down at Windsor, and it was reported across the province that we will build a big blue machine that will roll from one side of this province to the other and bring us victory at Queen's Park. He used the phrase, but it didn't catch on the way that Claire Hoy's use of it, and Claire, I think, was certainly unaware of that earlier reference. But it was probably makes the point, right, that at two different intervals in this history of the party, there was this quest to build a political machine.
And he may not have known he was starting it, but a guy named Dalton Camp was sort of the founding member. Now, we're going to have lots of viewers who don't remember who Dalton Camp was, so fill in the blank.
Well, Dalton Kingsley Camp was born in New Brunswick, and if he had any politics, it was with the Liberal Party. But his formative years were in Massachusetts and then particularly California, because his father became not only a Baptist minister well after he was born, but they moved to the United States, and he was on the speaker's circuit as a very powerful and persuasive, charismatic, well-informed preacher, speaker on global issues. And Dalton grew up in that milieu in California, Democratic politics, with Earl Warren, who was running for governor, later was governor, was later Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. That was where Dalton Camp really fell in love with American politics, how dynamic it was, team sports, and journalism. And when his father at a very young age died of a heart attack and the family moved back to New Brunswick, he imported with him this great affection for the American way, and especially that he liked how Americans seemed to treat everything like a game, but they played for keeps.
As we're seeing right now,
yes,
south of the border. He not only imported that, but he also imported a guy from New Jersey who turned out to be his brother-in-law.
He did, because now that his family was Baptist, Dalton attended Acadia University, a Baptist university, and there was this lovely, bright, athletic, A+ student in economics, Linda Atkins. They fell in love. They got married during the war, and in her dowry was this much younger kid brother, Norman Kempton Atkins. And so that, from the first meeting, this Canadian soldier, Dalton Camp, he was back, he was in the war, he was in uniform, and this impressionable young boy, Dalton became the hero to Norman, and Norman would follow him anywhere, and it was whatever Dalton was doing would be the wind that filled his sails and the rudder that guided his ship. And so these two came together in running campaigns. And back to this idea about the political machine, Steve, Dalton cut his teeth in Liberal Party politics nationally and provincially in New Brunswick when Premier McNairn had a very entrenched Liberal government called the McNairn Machine. And it wasn't that Dalton didn't like machine politics. He appreciated the efficiency and the organization, the communication, the ability to win elections that was put together. He just didn't like the results of how New Brunswick was being governed at that time.
Which is how he ends up going from the Big Red Machine to the Big Blue Machine.
Correct. He decides that he would fight better battles and be truer to himself if he worked hard to defeat Grits. And so that became his life's mission. And what he also saw was the role that advertising executives played in the campaigns. And this is a key part of the story in the Big Blue Machine, this ascendancy of the advertising agencies as well as the pollsters, but the ad men and their fusion with the party organizations and the campaigns in the back rooms to an extraordinary degree, basically running the campaigns.
He really, though, in 1966 explodes onto the national scene when he challenges a man who at that point has become very unpopular, not only across the country, but particularly even within his own party, John Diefenbaker, the former prime minister. What did he do with Dief?
Well, what he did with Dief then was challenge the fact that he continued to be leader after having the largest government majority to date of members and then losing that and not giving up after a number of elections. But the important thing, Steve, is to go back. Everything that happens is like a series of links in a chain, and if you cut it in mid-60s, you'd say, well, that was causing this. But actually, if you went back into 1956, when Dalton was working for the party at headquarters in Ottawa as a campaign, as a communications officer for the party, writing all of its publicity and developing policy ideas, then is the introduction of television politics. The first convention, leadership convention in Canada that was televised was 1956 in Ottawa, the one that elected John Diefenbaker. And Camp was kept on with him after that to work on the whole theme for the campaign. And he figured out, Dalton did, that on all the issues, there was not agreement across the country, except on the one thing he saw that celebrating John George Diefenbaker, neither French, neither English, from the West, this populist guy, would be a refreshing change and get rid of a lot of the problems that the Tory party had had up to then. And so he ran a campaign that focused exclusively on John Diefenbaker. It's time for a Diefenbaker government was a slogan. It didn't say vote for the PC. It's time for a Diefenbaker government. It signaled a new change. And so what we have is Dalton Camp creating the cult around John Diefenbaker that then led to the largest win ever in 2 elections. And so this is the point I would like to stress, is that the arc of his life is very much like a Greek tragedy. And I bring this out in the book because here he was creating conditions that later, as you're talking about, when he tried to, as president of the party, get a leadership review underway to assess whether it wasn't time for Dief to go. He is now being bitten by the very force that he had earlier created.
Well, here's what you write in the book about that. The party is not the embodiment of the leader, but rather the other way around. The leader is transient, the party permanent. If the leader does not know the limits to his power, he must be taught. And when he is indifferent to the interests of his party, he must be reminded. Those were Dalton Camp's words, which back then were so controversial?
They were, because it was seen as a challenge to Diefenbaker, but he felt that it was necessary to establish that principle. It was a missing piece in the Canadian political system and the party system. That's the point of the Big Blue Machine. There's easily 24 innovations that you can trace to Camp and Atkins. And that was one. All the parties today have this. After a general election, if the party loses at the next gathering of the party at the annual meeting,
they review the leadership.
They have leadership
As
review.
they're doing to Tom Mulcair pretty soon.
That's right, exactly. Well, all these ideas were developed for the PCs by Camp, often with difficulty, but they became entrenched, and then they were generalized to the other parties.
This became huge, though, with the Conservative Party in the mid-60s, and it came down to a showdown at which punches were thrown, right? What happened there?
Well, the annual meeting at the Chateau Laurier was a confrontation between the Diefenbaker loyalists and who were generally seen at that time representing rural, small-town Canada, and Dalton Camp, who was a progressive, more urban approach, more at ease in the new media. Telepolitics had come in much more effectively by this time. And it was a night of a confrontation. And Dalton Camp was party president. John Diefenbaker was party leader. The annual meeting was going to vote for the new party president, so it was like a proxy vote on Dief. And I was at that annual meeting in the Chateau Laurier.
Did you see Mulroney get punched in the face?
I saw a lot of people being punched. I saw very difficult moments to witness. And I got to say, I left that Chateau Laurier at probably it was around 1:30 or 2 in the morning. Wet snow was on the ground, and I walked back up past the Peace Tower, and I looked at everything, and I was so disillusioned that I didn't get reconnected with politics for a couple of years after that.
Well, let me move you forward 5 years. Incident, we should say, I think Jack Horner was the guy who punched Roy McMurtry, who would go on to become Ontario's Attorney General. Roy fought back. Somebody punched a future Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, in the face. That was a real melee. Anyway, good chapter of the book.
Thank you.
Let's go fast forward 5 years now. It's 1971. Bill Davis has taken over the leadership of the Ontario PC Party, and the Big Blue Machine actually goes to him and says, Mr. Davis, we want to help run your operation, help make you Premier, and he turns him down. What happened there?
Well, the back end of the Robarts years in Ontario, what was happening within the Conservative Party wasn't what was happening in the province. And everybody in the Conservative Party thought that Bill Davis was going to be the leader, would be a coronation. Robarts himself in the final year, increasingly disinterested really in governance. Anybody would approach him and say, well, see Davis, he's going to be Premier, let him deal with it. And all the ministers and caucus members, with very few exceptions, lined up to support Bill Davis, and he almost lost because he didn't agree that the Big Blue Machine, Camp and Atkins and their team, who, by the way, just previously at the Maple Leaf Gardens had succeeded in getting Robert Stanfield elected national leader of the Conservatives. When Stanfield entered in 4th position, they were able to sell the Conservative Party on Bob Stanfield, who I knew and worked for, but he was a very long drink of water. And so that showed what they could do. Well, because they were turned down by Davis, who didn't want it to look like so overboard a win for him, they said, well, we don't want to sit on the sidelines. They supported Alan Lawrence. They got him into the race, and they came within 44 votes of beating Bill Davis. The point is that Davis then realized, if I could lose a sure bet within the Conservative Party, then it's automatic. I'm going to probably lose the province. That we've been in office for so long. I need this new organization that clearly has demonstrated what it can do. And so at a series of secret meetings, the deal was made. Bill Davis exhibited a lot of courage to actually replace a lot of the people that had been loyally with him, but weren't contemporary in political practices like the Blue Machinists, and made the deal with them. And Norman Atkins became the campaign manager, and a whole new era came in with Bill Davis being elected as Premier, which is then he was able to do many things, including advance the cause of getting an educational television channel and network in the province of Ontario. So here we are sitting today in the William G. Davis studio.
We are. And you think the Big Blue Machine had a lot to do with that?
If they hadn't helped Davis win, you and I wouldn't be sitting here this morning.
Okay. You know, it's interesting. I look at a lot of the pictures in your book. There are no women in any of these pictures. The Big Blue Machine was really a male-only organization, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was typical of the era, but it was especially a clubby organization. The Big Blue Machine took over the Albany Club for about a quarter of a century. And that was a time when the issue came up, and I was a member of the club at the time, and we voted to admit women members.
What year was this?
This was in the early 1970s.
Okay.
Then also, Norman Atkins really believed that everybody that was part of his team, and it was an extensive group of recruited, talented individuals, very diverse in their skills, which did include some women, but not many. were best if they could bond and spend a lot of time together knowing each other as friends. And then they wouldn't fight with each other during the pressure and controversy as an election campaign is underway. So he organized weekend retreats and then something called the Rough-In, a big tennis tournament, and classic guys weekend in New Brunswick. And then even in time that became co-ed. A lot of the women, in fact, some who were there now cabinet ministers in Ottawa or had been cabinet ministers, like Kelly Leach, for example, who may be running for the federal leadership. So there's a lot of continuity there, and Norman was very much, they all liked the male clubbiness, they liked that. But he recognized and fostered the careers of a lot of women, bringing them forward. So I think your point, Steve, is that this book, by really tracing the evolution of Canadian politics and elections through this whole period, from when television starts right up to the digital age, through the lives of these two men, Atkins and Camp, and their entourage and the Big Blue Machine, really chronicles a lot of the evolution of our society, including the women, the role of women in public life, and the back rooms.
Right. We should just sort of finish the story on the Davis years. His government gets into some trouble, and he's held to a minority government in 75 and 77, but then things start to improve, and the Big Blue Machine runs what has been described in the book as the perfect campaign in 1981, and Davis reclaims his majority government. Why was 81 a perfect campaign for the BBM? Well,
they won it. so that's the part of this, is that a lot of people will look at and be impressed by what's going on in the back rooms and how they had developed deep polling based on values, using Americans and American techniques. Television, the Leaders Tour that focuses just on the leader, not all the other candidates. Having the uniform logo that is branded the whole party.
That was a fight, wasn't it? I mean, up until then, you could basically put whatever you wanted on your own signs, and then Norman Atkins changed that.
Candidates would sit at the kitchen table and write up their brochure and get it locally printed. Now it all came down from the center, and Norman Atkins had a hard time, but he was convinced as an ad man that you needed that tie-in. This, again, the role of advertising in this is fundamentally important. And all of these changes that they brought about fused in a way that won. My point is that sometimes with the best of the techniques, they lost, and other times they won. And throughout here, I talk about the electoral system, which, as you know, can have very distorting results. Parties can form majority governments with 39, 35, 40% of the vote, and have done. And I mention that throughout this book because that too became one of the strategic considerations for the backroom planners, was how do we work to split the vote, build up in Ontario, build up Stephen Lewis and the NDP to help offset the rise of the Liberals, and vote splitting. Fortunately, I think we're going to see the last of that federally, because Prime Minister Trudeau is following through on his commitment to get rid of this antiquated electoral system.
Let me ask you about two campaigns that the BBM was very much involved in, Norman Atkins in particular, the 84 and 88 majority governments for Brian Mulroney. And those campaigns went exceedingly well for the Conservatives both times. The thing I want to focus on here is Brian Mulroney, in some respects, because he wanted Bill Davis's support, put Norman Atkins in charge of his campaign, put him in the Senate, but then the relationship between these two men really deteriorates. What happened there?
Well, it's Bill Davis became a hero to Norman Atkins, and he thought highly of him for a lot of reasons. And that also coincided with the time that Dalton, because of what you're discussing 10 minutes ago, was really bruised and battered and disillusioned, and was drifting away from politics to do more of his great writing and things like that. And so kind of Bill Davis became the substitute hero for Norman. When he gets to Ottawa, he's hoping to have that same kind of relationship with Brian Mulroney as he had with Bill Davis. There's pictures in the book of them up all these places where they're hanging out guys being together. And well, Brian Mulroney is not that kind of man, and he's also the Prime Minister of all Canada. It's not a province, and he had a lot of other things there. And Norman wasn't able to have that kind of close relationship. Secondly, there was a power struggle within the party as to who was going to be in which positions. At Queen's Park, the Big Blue Machine had people like Brian Armstrong go into the Premier's office and control the agenda, control the access, be part of which Bill Davis willingly complied with, because he was the most political of our premiers after, following Robarts and Frost and Drew. This was his religion, and the legislature was his cathedral, and the province was his parish, so he was keenly part of this play. Well, in Ottawa, when Senator Finlay MacDonald and Norman Atkins suggested that Armstrong should go into Mulroney's office as a kind of a help out with the organization, and that idea didn't fly. And there was no real plan in the PMO as to how it was going to be carried out on the policy side, the caucus side, the government side, the media side, everything else. And after a while, the wheels started to come off.
Didn't Mulroney also express concern that it looked like Norman Atkins was taking too much credit for a victory that rightly should have been taken credit by the Prime Minister?
Well, that's right, because certainly within Quebec, Brian Mulroney was the cause of the PC's winning, and he'd won the leadership of the party by saying, why should we always start way back of the line, conceding 75 of the seats to the Liberals in Quebec? And he changed that in part because of who he is as a solid Quebecer, and also because of his pact with the Liberal Premier, Robert Bourassa, who was very supportive of the Mulroney PCs in Quebec in that election. So yeah, Brian Mulroney was very important in Quebec, and he and Mila were great campaigners nationally. I mean, if you're going from Robert Stanfield to Brian Mulroney, you're going from night to day. He was the first stage performer that the party had as a national leader. And
we should remind everybody that when he won, you won.
Well,
you were one of his MPs.
That's right, I was.
Okay. Let's finish up here on 1985. Bill Davis retires, and the new guy who takes over, Frank Miller, whose son is an MPP at Queen's Park today still. Frank Miller says the days of the Big Blue Machine are over. And Premier Davis urges Miller to use the talents of the Big Blue Machine to help him win that election, and Miller ostracizes them. In hindsight, dumb decision?
Well, Frank Miller, a fine and bright man, was never politically astute. I know this firsthand. I mean, I know Frank very well. He tutored me in high school when I couldn't get high school chemistry. I would go and see him once every week, and he's a chemical engineer. I learned chemistry from him. We were in the same church choir. He followed my dad, who was a member for Muskoka District in the legislature. We had to take him around and show him that when you went to turkey suppers, it wasn't to eat the turkey, it was to meet the people. And then when he got to Queen's Park, Frank made a lot of very serious errors in policy judgment, in my view, because he didn't understand politics, and his political antenna were not visible. You couldn't see that he was able to understand high-level politics. So when it came to, and he ran and won the leadership against 3 other candidates, all of whom were from Metro Toronto. So all that feeling across the province crystallized and against Davis and against the Big Blue Machine crystallized in the Frank Miller campaign, and it was one that had that anti-Toronto animus to it. And getting rid of the Big Blue Machine, you've got to remember, this is after 40-some years of the party being in office. I'm like a Jefferson Democrat. I think 8 years and you should be gone. That you need the frequent turnover, because parties do get tired, and vested interests encrust themselves around those in power. So you want that constant refreshment. But the key thing, on your point, Frank Miller did close out the Big Blue Machine. We don't want you. So they went to basically amateur hour and lost. And years later, those people that had been so against the Big Blue Machine were actually following its techniques, but they didn't, but so were all the other parties too. So it was kind of like back to level playing field.
Big Blue Machine, BBM RIP, as they say.
Yes.
Had a heck of a good run, though. The Big Blue Machine, How Tory Campaign Backrooms Changed Canadian Politics Forever. J. Patrick Boyer, great to have you back here at TVO for this
Thank you,
chat,
Steve.
Patrick.
You like
Thank
the
you.
book?
Yeah, I like the book very much. Oh, yeah, yeah. No, it's great. Very nostalgic. I mean, I sort of remember some of this stuff, right?
Thank
Good
you.
stuff.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.